The Admiral stood before the sea of cameras, his crisp navy uniform gleaming under the floodlights, medals catching every flicker of light like tiny suns. His voice, steady but burdened by truth, cut through the silence. Vladimir Putin has already lost the war in Ukraine, not because of missiles or tanks, but because he underestimated the human spirit. That single sentence sent shockwaves across the world. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict. Behind the Admiral's words lay years of sacrifice, courage, and defiance that had transformed the battlefield into a symbol of human endurance. Admiral Jonathan Reeves had spent over 40 years serving under NATO's command, from the cold shadow of the Berlin Wall to the chaotic dawn of the 21st century. He had seen wars begin and end, but none had pierced his heart like this one. The Ukraine conflict, for him, was not just another geopolitical chess match. It was a struggle for the soul of freedom itself. He still remembered the early days of the invasion. The night sky over Kiev had burned red as Russian missiles rained down. People ran through streets clutching children, pets, photographs, their entire lives packed into trembling hands. The world watched in horror as cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv turned into ruins. Reeves, then a senior NATO strategist, had spent sleepless nights in Brussels, his eyes fixed on live satellite feeds showing devastation and bravery side by side. Yet what stunned him most wasn't the destruction, it was the resistance. Ukrainian farmers towing away Russian tanks with tractors, old women handing sunflower seeds to soldiers and saying, "So flowers will grow where you fall," teenagers using smartphones to guide drones, turning technology into weapons of hope. The spirit of a nation refused to bow. Reeves often whispered to himself, "This is not just a war, it's history being written in courage." As the months dragged on, Putin's once feared army began to falter. What was supposed to be a 3-day blitzkrieg turned into a grinding nightmare. Supply lines collapsed, soldiers went hungry, morale sank beneath the weight of lies, and back in Moscow, propaganda tried to hide what the battlefield made clear. Russia had walked into a trap of its own arrogance. Reeves watched it unfold from NATO headquarters, his heart heavy. He knew that wars aren't truly won with weapons, they're won with will, and Ukraine's will was unbreakable. When Western nations hesitated, fearing escalation, it was Reeves who stood in front of the Defense Council and said, "If we abandon them now, we abandon everything we stand for." His words stirred the room. Within weeks, aid shipments and modern weapons began to flow eastward, but even with support, the cost was unbearable. Reeves flew secretly to Poland in early 2023 to meet Ukrainian officers. There he met Colonel Andriy Melnik, a young father, his uniform worn, eyes hollow but fierce. They spoke late into the night. Melnik told him, "I used to be an engineer. My hands built things, now they destroy. But if I stop, my children will have no future to build for." Reeves could only nod. That sentence haunted him for months. Back home, he watched the news of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, of the stunning liberation of Kherson, the defiant raising of the blue and yellow flag. The world began to realize something profound. Russia might still possess bombs and tanks, but Ukraine had captured hearts. And once the world's empathy aligns with a cause, victory becomes more than a matter of territory. It becomes destiny. When Reeves finally addressed the NATO summit in 2024, he didn't bring charts or battle maps. He brought stories of mothers cooking for soldiers in bunkers, of children learning in candlelit basements, of a sniper who refused to leave her post until her village was free. Putin, Reeves said solemnly, may control land for a time, but he will never control people who refuse to be conquered. You can't occupy courage. As he spoke, he could see leaders wiping tears discreetly, soldiers in the back standing taller. For Reeves, this wasn't triumph, it was truth. Russia's losses were no longer measured in tanks destroyed or soldiers killed, but in the collapse of an illusion. The illusion that fear can rule forever, the illusion that power can silence freedom. Months later, a documentary crew followed Reeves to a refugee camp near Lviv. There he met a little girl named Katya, clutching a broken doll. When he asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she replied softly, "A pilot. I want to protect my sky." Reeves smiled through tears. In her eyes, he saw the future Putin could never destroy. The war dragged on, but the outcome was already sealed. Not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of people. The Russian army could bomb buildings, but not beliefs. They could invade cities, but not dreams. Reeves often repeated this truth in interviews, and it became his defining statement. Putin lost the war the moment Ukrainians refused to surrender. As peace talks slowly emerged and the world began to rebuild, Reeves retired quietly, his hair silver, his medals stored away. But every evening, he'd walk by the harbor, watch the sunset, and think of Ukraine, its cities scarred but standing, its people bloodied but unbroken. He knew wars come and go, but courage leaves ripples that last forever. In his final interview, when asked what lesson the world should learn from Ukraine, Reeves leaned forward, his voice soft but resolute. Never underestimate the power of a free people. Weapons can destroy, but freedom inspires. And as long as there are hearts that believe, tyranny has already lost. The interviewer paused, speechless. Reeves looked out the window at the horizon, where the fading light met the sea. For him, that horizon wasn't just the end of a day. It was the dawn of a new era, because in the end, Putin hadn't just lost a war. He had lost the one thing no dictator can ever reclaim, the soul of his own people and the respect of the world. And as Ukraine's anthem echoed across the rebuilt streets of Kiev, the world finally understood the Admiral's words. The war wasn't won by armies. It was won by the unbreakable light of human spirit, one that no darkness could ever extinguish. The room was quiet after the Admiral's final words. Cameras clicked, flashes erupted, and yet, for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Admiral Reeves looked down at the papers on the podium, but he didn't need them anymore. His message had already sunk deep into the hearts of everyone listening. But what few knew was that behind that calm, commanding voice was a man who had carried the weight of hundreds of decisions, some that saved lives, others that haunted him every night. After the press conference, Reeves returned to his office overlooking the North Sea. Rain lashed against the glass as he stood, staring at the horizon. The war might be fading from the front pages, but he knew the real battles were far from over. Thousands were still displaced, families separated, soldiers still missing. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, hands trembling slightly. For all his experience, Reeves could never get used to the cost of war. His mind drifted back to a meeting in early 2022, just days after Russia's invasion began. The NATO Council had been in chaos, some leaders afraid of escalation, others demanding immediate intervention. Reeves had slammed his hand on the table and said, "We can't let fear write history." That sentence had shifted the tone of the entire room. Within hours, a coordinated strategy began forming, one that would eventually change the course of the war. But that night, as he walked home, he remembered the faces of those he had sent to the front lines. Command meant responsibility, and responsibility always came with ghosts. Meanwhile, across the shattered cities of Ukraine, stories of defiance continued to inspire him. A young nurse named Irina who stayed behind in Kharkiv, treating soldiers in a basement hospital as bombs fell overhead. An old man in Bucha who played the violin each evening in the ruins of his apartment block, saying, "If I stop playing, they win." Reeves read every report, every letter. He pinned them on the wall of his office, not as reminders of pain, but as proof of what humanity could endure. By 2025, the tide had fully turned. Russia's economy was breaking under sanctions, and its army was bleeding morale. Ukrainian forces, now whelmed, drained and supported, began pushing deeper into occupied territories. Reeves watched in silence as each liberated town appeared on his screen. He whispered to himself, "Freedom always finds a way." One evening, he received a message from Colonel Melnik, the same officer he had met years earlier. It was short but powerful. "We've retaken my village. My children are home." Reeves felt tears burn his eyes. He printed that message and kept it in his notebook. A quiet victory far greater than any headline. The war's turning point came not through a massive offensive, but through something more invisible, a loss of belief. Inside Russia, soldiers no longer understood why they were fighting. Families mourned sons sent to die in a conflict that no longer had a clear purpose. Even loyal generals began to question the orders coming from the Kremlin. Putin's iron control was rusting. Reeves once said to a journalist, "A leader loses not when he runs out of bullets, but when he runs out of trust." Months later, Reeves attended a peace conference in Geneva. Across the table sat diplomats from Ukraine, NATO, and even a few nervous Russian envoys. For the first time in years, there was a fragile hope in the air. The Admiral didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Everyone in that room knew that the war's outcome wasn't just about territory. It was about restoring humanity. After the meeting, he walked outside into the snowy night. The city lights reflected off the white streets, quiet and peaceful. He closed his eyes and listened, not to gunfire or sirens, but to the sound of normal life returning. Somewhere, far away, children were sleeping without fear for the first time in years. Reeves retired soon after, moving to a quiet coastal village in Scotland. He spent his mornings walking along the cliffs, the sea wind sharp but clean. Every now and then, he would receive letters from Ukrainians thanking him for his support. He never replied publicly. He simply smiled, folded the letters carefully, and placed them in a small wooden box labeled Hope. Years later, during an interview marking the anniversary of the war's end, Reeves was asked one final question. "Do you believe the world truly learned from Ukraine?" He took a long pause before answering. "The world often forgets lessons," he said softly, "but this one is written too deeply to fade. Ukraine taught us that power doesn't come from weapons or fear, it comes from unity, resilience, and love for one's home. Putin may have had an army, but Ukraine had a heartbeat, and in the end that heartbeat outlasted every missile." He looked up at the horizon, the waves crashing beneath the setting sun, and whispered to himself, he already lost. Long before the first shot was fired, the camera zoomed out, the Admiral's silhouette framed against the golden sea. His words lingered, echoing like a promise to generations yet to come. No tyrant wins forever. The human spirit always rises. And somewhere far away, in the rebuilt streets of Kiev, a little girl named Katya looked up at the sky, now free, now peaceful, and whispered, "Thank you." The world had moved on, but the lesson remained eternal. Freedom, once awakened, can never be conquered.